The first time I went to Halifax, Nova Scotia, I was a labor organizer named Tony Tracy there. A wonderful guy brought me to a cemetery where a man named Robert Ross is buried, and they said they. You know, and I hadn't really looked into it. It was kind of before Wikipedia and before I had a cell phone and all that. And so, you know, research was slightly harder than it is now to do. And so I didn't actually bother looking up the guy. But I was always confused by the fact that every time Canadians mentioned Robert Ross, he was either Canadian or British or Irish. And it was always unclear exactly the origins of the guy. And now that I understand sort of the complicated phenomenon of Ireland, I understand why you could be confused about who this guy is. I believe he would have considered himself British, although he was born and raised in Rostrevor. And Tommy was asked to write a song about him, and couldn't come up with anything. And I was visiting him in Rostrevor and visiting the monument there to Robert Ross, and I thought, you know, he did accomplish at least one redeeming. There's at least one redeeming achievement that this man has to his life, I would say, and I thought I could write a song about the guy, despite the fact that he had a lot of non-redeeming achievements. Is that a fiddle? What is that? Is it? Robert Ross was from Rostrevor. He was born in County Down. His family was given land there by the British Crown. He was a man born of the gentry, born with wealth and fame, but he joined the British Army to serve his queen and make his name. In the Napoleonic Wars, he fought in many lands, in Holland and in Spain, in the far-off Egyptian sands. He was wounded there in battle, came back to fight another day, and he was sent off to attack the USA. York had been sacked and burned by invading Yankee men, but the Canadians regrouped, chased the Yankees home, and then the British Navy made its way to the shores of D.C. town, where General Ross burned the White House down. The year was 1814, the U.S. was in retreat. It was a Canadian victory, an American defeat. Without the French to help them, they got their ass whipped by the Crown when General Ross burned the White House down. The place had just been constructed only 12 years before, but it had to be rebuilt soon after this disastrous war. The president turned tail and ran like a raggedy clown when General Ross burned the White House down. He was killed a few months later. Irish rebels stopped him in his tracks. He was buried in Nova Scotia, in the town of Halifax. He might have been forgotten, but he'll forever be renowned. He's the man who burned the White House down. He's the man who burned the White House down. They especially like that song in Canada. That's Canada is the only place you'll get unqualified, cheering every time the White House gets burnt down. With the, each, they never get tired of cheering after that. Well, it was. I mean, it was Canada at the time, but it was still, very much a part of Britain, in some, direct sense. But the U.S. at the time thought that people, some leaders in the United States thought that maybe Canada wanted to be liberated by the U.S. and for whatever reason the Canadians didn't want to be liberated. And in fact, but the form of liberation was a bit awkward. The American soldiers went into what is now Toronto, which was then called York, and burned the place to the ground, which is usually not the way to endear yourself with the local population, and in fact did not. And so, and of course it also didn't help that the U.S. troops were about starving by the time they actually made it up there. They didn't really provision themselves properly, and And of course, the American Revolution was largely won by the French, and the French were busy having a revolution, and they weren't really there to help out. So, that was